In this video, we'll be talking about positioning. So positioning is a very important strategy in marketing. And through this video, we'll have a better understanding of what positioning is and some of the strategies that positioning entails. So this slide shows you an overview between segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So segmentation is about dividing the customers, partitioning the customers. Targeting is about once you've segmented the customers, deciding which segment that you're going to go after, attack. And then positioning is once you've decided on targeting, how are you going to, without using the word positioning in its definition, how are you going to, portray and communicate what your brand stands for in the minds of the customers? We'll more formally define positioning a little bit later, but I think for now, we can understand positioning as how a company communicates and portrays or conveys what the brand stands for in the minds of the customers. So what is positioning? More formally defined, it is an act of designing the company's offering to occupy a distinct place in the minds of the target market. Okay, so basically what this entails is that it's what companies can do to occupy a unique place in the minds of the customers for a given target, right? Because customers, they have their own way of understanding what brands, stand for. So when you think of, Old Spice, people have this understanding or, image of Old Spice in their minds. And what positioning is, what can firms do to either change or implant what their brand stands for in the minds of customers? So obviously, companies would want to implant and create a unique position in the minds of customers that would be advantageous to them. And in order to understand this positioning concept a little bit deeper, I think it would be helpful to understand the difference between brand image versus brand identity. Now, we kind of use these two terms interchangeably and loosely, but strictly speaking, technically speaking, these two are quite different. So brand image, it refers to the image or a reputation that a product, service, or firm currently possesses in the marketplace. So in other words, this is the customer's perception of how they view a brand, a product or a service or a company. So it's the customer's perspective of how they think about a brand. Whereas brand identity is a unique set of associations the marketer would like to create and maintain for a brand. So in other words, brand identity is from the firm's perspective. So this is how a company would want the market or the customers to view their brand or to view what their brand stands for. So again, brand image is from the customer's understanding, perspective, view of what a brand looks like, stands for. Whereas brand identity is what the company would like the customers to view their brand, how they would like the customers to understand their brand. Which, if you think about it, these two, in an ideal world, we would like them to overlap as much as possible. We want the customers to understand the brand in a way that the company would like the customers to understand the brand. But, in reality, that may not necessarily be the case. So I'll show you that, shortly a little bit later, but just to, reiterate, so identity is the way a company aims to identify or position itself in the marketplace or in the minds of the customers. Whereas image is the way the public perceives the company or its products. Right? So the image is how the customers actually do it, whereas identity is how the company wants the customers to do it. So having said this, and now that we understand the distinction between brand identity and brand image, if we use these to redefine positioning, we can define this as the process of establishing and sustaining an intended brand identity in the marketplace or in the minds of the customers. So I guess the key word in this definition is brand identity, right? It's not brand image, but it's brand identity, because who is doing positioning? Positioning is executed and implemented by a company. Therefore, it is the process of establishing in the minds of the customers or in the marketplace. And once established, they want to sustain this. And what do they want to sustain and establish? It's the intended brand identity, what the brand stands for in the minds of the customer. It's how they want the customers to understand their brand. Right? So that's what positioning is. So positioning helps guide marketing strategy by clarifying the product's essence, by clarifying what the product stands for. So, we can list several brands that we are well aware of, such as Volvo, Walmart, and Starbucks. And these are companies that have a very strong positioning. Why? Because their brand identity is very clear, it's very transparent. People understand what their brand stands for, and therefore there's a pretty good overlap between brand identity and brand image, because the customers understand what the brand stands for, and that coincides with how the company wants the customers to understand their brand. So for instance, Volvo, their hallmark, their DNA, so to speak, has been and always has been about safety, right? Their brand is about safety. So when people think about Volvo, the first thing that pops up in their minds is that, Volvo is a brand that stands for safety. So their brand identity and how they position their brand, revolves around safety issues. Walmart, it's about, low cost, one-stop, shopping. But it's primarily about low price. And that's very clear, in the marketplace. Everyone understands that. Customers understand that. And Walmart, they execute their positioning strategy that is consistent with a low pricing strategy. And that's how customers understand them. And the same thing goes for Starbucks, right? Starbucks seems to position on multiple issues: customer preference for quality, for experience, for menu variety, for accessibility. Again, the positioning strategy and the brand identity for Starbucks is fairly clear, and people have a good grasp of what Starbucks stands for. So this is going back to the Volvo example. Just shows you that Volvo introduces daytime running headlights. Again, this is for safety, right? In some parts of the world, daytime running headlights are they're mandatory. But Volvo, they develop cars that and they use these advertisements to reiterate what their brand stands for. So this is part of their positioning strategy. And the same thing with this. It's about safety. This may seem a little bit traumatic here, but they're sending a very strong message that Volvo can keep your family safe, your kids safe, and so forth. So, like I said before, effective positioning, we can think about this by using these Venn diagrams. So we have three scenarios, A, B, and C. And in A, this is where there's no overlap between image and identity. In B, there's slight overlap. And in C, there's significant overlap. So the best case scenario, the most effective positioning out of these three would be C. C is where the identity and the image overlap. So in other words, customers understand the brand in a way that the company wants the customers to understand their brand. That would be C. Whereas as you go from C to B to A, that becomes less so. So in A, there's a gap, there's a gulf, So customers do not understand the brand, and they don't have an image perception of the brand the way that the company wants the customers to have an understanding of their brand, which is a problem. So as we'll see a little bit later, when there's like A or B, companies engage in what's called repositioning, right? They're going to have to reposition their brands so that it moves more closer to something that looks like C. How do companies execute positioning? Well, it's through the 4 Ps. The 4 Ps are product, price, place, and promotion. Right? These are the 4 Ps. These are the marketing mix. So all companies, it's just a matter of degree, implement positioning in the marketplace, or for that matter, repositioning in the marketplace, utilizing these 4 Ps. They change their product. They change the design. Right? They change the packaging. They change their price. They change where they sell their products. They change how they, communicate, advertise to the customers. They may engage in less, sales. Why? Because they want to now, give out a more, higher quality image to the customers. So then that would be, promotion. They're changing their promotion strategy. So companies execute positioning, utilizing, the 4 Ps. Okay, how do you establish positioning? Well, the first step is you define the competitive frame of reference. The second is you define the basis of positioning, and you do that through points of difference. We call that POD, right? Points of difference. And then POP, points of parity. And then through types of POPs, point of parity. And there's 2 different types of point of parity: category POP and competitive POP. So let's take a closer look at what we mean by these different terminologies in this framework. So first step, establish a frame of reference. So a reference is like an anchoring point, right? It's something that people use to compare with, to understand, to better understand what a product stands for. So when you first engage in positioning, you have to establish a frame of reference, right? A frame of anchoring, so that customers can easily relate to the product by comparing it to something that they already know. So, for instance, Red Bull, the example of Red Bull. So, in Thailand, Red Bull, a lot of these energy drinks in Thailand, they're sold in a certain type of bottle, these medicine type of bottle. They look very different, right, from the Red Bull that's sold in the U.S. or North America, where it's sold in cans, because a lot of the energy drinks in Thailand are sold in these, sort of brown-looking, medicine bottles. So, in order for Red Bull to, minimize resistance, to minimize relearning of customers, and to facilitate the frame of reference, because everything else, all the other energy drinks are sold in medicine bottles, they sell them in medicine bottles as well in this country, right? Because then they're established this frame of reference, which minimizes people to learn what if they sold them in cans, they may wonder, what is this product and why are they selling in cans? So in order to prevent that from happening, they go with the flow, as in terms of what other people are doing, because that has already established a frame of reference, and that just eases, makes things a lot easier for Red Bull. So next is POP, POP. That's what it stands for, and POP. There's 2 different types: category POP and competitive POP. So in a nutshell, point of parity means the same, right? Parity means equivalence, identical, being identical. So category POP means that these are the features or the attributes that a brand needs to have to compete in a given industry or category. So it's kind of like a must-have, right? Whereas a competitive POP is a feature or an attribute that a company wants to include in their brand, not necessarily to provide a point of differentiation compared to the competitor, but it's a type of attribute or feature that's included to neutralize, to negate, to neutralize the playing field between the company, the focal company, and the competitor. So, for instance, Mac Cafe. So, when McCafe started to include, better, higher quality coffees, healthier, drinks, shakes, smoothies, and so forth, it's not that they wanted to, take customers away from Starbucks or to take customers away from, delis or through pastry stores, but the intent was to neutralize some of the point of differences that their competitors had. In other words, by doing that, they could at least be included in the consideration set. So if they didn't have, imagine if they didn't have this, McDonald's would not even be included in the consideration set when customers are thinking about, healthier options. But by including some of these healthier options on their menu, it's not that they want to, be Starbucks. It's not that they want to be like, other pastries, stores, but they want just to be included in the consideration set so that it sort of chips away and neutralizes and dilutes some of the PODs that the competitors had, right? So, sometimes, a lot of the times, people think that, it's just the PODs that are important, right? Point of differences. But POPs can be very important as well because POPs are the must-haves, like the category POP. And if a brand does not establish this must-have, the minimum standard, then the PODs don't really matter, right? Because then the customers are not going to even consider the brand when it doesn't even meet the minimum requirement, right? So it's very fundamental and not to be taken lightly that companies need to be cautious to have the category POPs or the competitive POPs before they just start focusing just merely or solely on the PODs. Like I said, the PODs are the point of difference, and the PODs, there could be two different types. Why there could be favorable PODs and unfavorable PODs, but obviously we're going to be focusing on favorable PODs because these are the point of differences that will set you apart from the pack, from the competition. Two characteristics are desirability and deliverability. So under desirability would be obviously relevance. The feature or the attribute has to be relevant to the customer. They have to be distinct, unique, idiosyncratic. They have to be believable, right? They just can't be like, oh, that's nonsense, right? I mean, that's unbelievable. That can't be true, right? Because it's too good to be true. So it has to be believable to the customers. And then in terms of deliverability, they have to be feasible, right? So, they have to have the technology to make this, feasible, right? To commercialize this. And then they have to be able to communicate this to the customers. And then the last but not least is, the longer the POD can be sustainable and not be copied and imitated by a competitor, the better it is. Because once a favorable POD becomes non-sustainable and it's copied, then the POD becomes a POP, right? Because now it's not sustainable. Okay, so another way of looking at this is, again, through this Venn diagram. And we have three circles here. And on the left circle, we have the company's offerings, the company's product or services. On the right, we have the customer's needs. And then at the bottom circle, we have a competitor's offering. So if you sort of overlap these three circles onto one another, there can be overlapping space, but there also can be spaces that are just occupied by one of those circles that are not overlapped by the other two circles. So if you look at A, right, that A is an overlap between the company's offering and the customer's needs, but is not met by the competitor's offering. So that would be an example of a firm's POD, right? Because that's something that my company has that is meeting the customer's needs, but is not being met by a competitor's offering. Whereas something like C will be the opposite, right? So that's a space where a customer's need is being met by a competitor offering, but it's not being met by my company's offering. Whereas something like B is where the three circles all overlap, all right? So that is kind of like a POP. That's a POP, right? Because That's a customer's need that is being met not only by my company's offering, but also by a competitor's company's offering. Therefore, it's not a POD from my end, nor is it a POD from the competitor's perspective. Hence, it's a POP, a POP. And then if you look at E, that's something like, it's an unmet need. It's like white space, where, there is no product on the market from my company or from any other competitor. And it's kind of like a blue ocean. It's something that the customer needs exist, but it's being unmet by any market offering out there, by anybody. So that's a space that, if a competitor can, or if my company can develop a product and launch a product in the market and satisfy that, that would be my firm's POD. But if a competitor would do that before me, then that would be a competitor's POD. And then things like F or G are spaces that are not good spaces, right? Because there is no customer, there is no need from a customer, but it may be something that my company may be focusing on, or a competitor may be focusing on, but the customer, the market really doesn't need it. So you may be wasting your resources and time in trying to develop a product that the market just simply does not need. Brand positioning statement. Okay, so how do we develop we talked about positioning, so how do we develop a brand positioning statement? Well, there's a formula, sort of, this is a agreed upon formula, and the formula goes such as the following. Among target market, so that's we talked about target, right? Target market. X is the brand of frame of reference. We talked about frame of reference. That point of difference, that's the pod, right? Because reason to believe, right? So it has 5. It has 5 elements, right? It has 5 elements in this positioning, brand positioning statement. So target market needs to be included in this statement. The name of the brand, the frame of the reference, the POD, the pod, and then why that POD is believable. What's the reason to believe that POD is real, right? So these 5 elements need to be included to be an effective brand positioning statement. So let's just briefly, go over, just show you what it would look like. We all know Gatorade, right? What Gatorade's brand positioning statement would look like. So it'd be like 2 active athletes of all ages and performance levels who love to compete, right, and rely on liquid replenishment to stay at their competitive best. Right, so we have the target group, and then we have the brand name. Gatorade is the brand of thirst quencher or body replenisher. That's the competitive frame of reference. That's what the brand is about. That delivers the following point of difference, right? POD, the benefit. That best satisfies thirst and replenishes you so you can keep achieving your personal best. Because the following is the reason to believe that POD. Because it's the only brand endorsed, used by all major U.S. pro sports, and Gatorade's well-known, athletically proven formula. Right? So in this brand positioning statement of Gatorade, it includes the 5 elements that we just talked about. Okay, now moving on to repositioning. Okay, so sometimes companies need to reposition their brand because, for various reasons, right? It's not being understood properly, or because they want to differentiate themselves from the market and so forth. So this is an example of, a dishwasher cleaner, a liquid, and how they position this differently in between Central Eastern European countries, CEE, and WE, Western European countries. So for CEE, the primary benefit is on cleaning, right? So a dishwashing liquid or a tab can have 2 benefits, a primary benefit and a secondary benefit. So obviously, it has to clean. That's a no-brainer. But it would be nice if it could shine the dishes or the glasses as well without leaving any stains or marks. So the cleaning is the primary benefit, and then the shining is the secondary benefit. In the Central Eastern European market, the primary benefit, the cleaning aspect, is emphasized. So that's what's the focal point of their positioning strategy is. Whereas they would reposition this differently in the Western European market. In the Western European market, cleaning is a given. So now they focus on the secondary benefit, which is the shining attribute that a dishwashing liquid or tablet would have. So the point here is, right, depending on which market, right, you are positioning your brand in, you may emphasize different aspects, different benefits, and that would entail a repositioning strategy. That would be considered a repositioning strategy. Because in one market you are positioning in this way, positioning in manner X, whereas in another market you are positioning in a manner Y. So you are repositioning depending on the target market that you are focusing on. Which leads us to different types of repositioning strategies, right? So in this 2x2 matrix, we can think of 4 different repositioning strategies. So on the x-axis, we have the target market, unchanged, changed. On the y-axis, we have products, unchanged, changed. So if you do not change your product and you do not change your market, then we call that image repositioning. In other words, the physical nature of the product doesn't change, nor does the target market. All you're trying to change is your image, right? How people view your product. That would be classified as an image repositioning. When your products don't change, but your market does, right? So you have the same product, but you're just selling it in a different market, whether it's domestic or global, then that will be classified as a market repositioning. So because you're targeting a different market. And then if you don't change your target market, but you do change your product, that will be classified as a product repositioning, right? So your target market doesn't change, but you change you add more features, or you delete features, or you change the packaging, or whatever it may be, then that will be classified as a product repositioning. And then the most major, where both change, the product changes, the market changes, that would be total repositioning. So let me give you just one example. So if you look at I guess let's look at Volvo. Yeah, Volvo. Or maybe we could even look at Cadillac. I mean, that would be an example of a total repositioning. Why? Because if you look at Cadillac or Volvo, go back 20 years, 30 years versus the last recently 5 years, their products, their automobiles have changed dramatically. Their designs have changed totally. And they're targeting different targets now. Usually those were people in their 50s, 60s, or above, older customers. Now they're targeting, people in their 30s, people who have, families that have young kids. It's a lot more aerodynamic. So their target market has changed, but so have their products. Their designs have changed. And that same thing can, the logic can be used to explain Old Spice. Old Spice can be considered a total repositioning as well. Now they're targeting, the younger, generation, the Gen X's and Y's, whereas in the past it was older people that used Old Spice. And by doing that, they've changed their products. They've changed their, advertising strategy to make it a lot more dynamic. They've changed their scent, and so forth. So, brands engage in repositioning, depending on how they change their target market and their products.